I'm Robert Sokolow. I'm on the Faculty of Engineering, and I spend most of my time at the Princeton Environmental Institute, which is the host today of a remarkable man. I don't know what I suspect it will be a remarkable story and a remarkable lecture. But I've learned something about Jim Glanz's career getting ready for this. He has a PhD in astrophysics from Princeton, and did that over a period of time when he was also developing as a writer, and made the career shift while being a PhD student. I don't know anybody who's quite done that. He finished his degree anyway. At that time, the head of the plasma physics for public affairs, Rush Holt, had not yet decided to be a congressman. We are very pleased to have Rush among us today. And there are other of Jim's friends from the plasma physics days who are here. We welcome all of them. Jim is from Iowa, and his first book was about soil conservation and soil science in the Iowa area and in general. Then he went to the New York Times, and he's had an amazing set of jobs there. He covered Twin Towers at the time of the collapse. As the technical guy, who could say why the buildings collapsed as much as anybody could. That was very first days. He wrote a book about that experience. And then went to Baghdad, and he was the bureau chief. I was in the Baghdad office for 5 years, bureau chief at the end of that. And now he's been, since 2009, at the investigation desk, which, as I understand it, means you can do anything for the Times, and has been investigating the oil spill. So you see his title up there, The Dangers of Drilling Deep. Welcome, Jim Glanz.
Okay, let's make sure this works. Do I have sound? The microphone? Okay, I'll go over here then. That good? I'm not sure it's actually on, but we may have to do it. We'll have to do it audio.
People could come forward.
Yeah.
Do you have mics on your lapel?
I have several mics on my lapel. Yeah. Well, it says it's on, but yeah. We may want to move this up a little bit, the mic up a little bit. So I'll start. But anyway, thank you for that kind introduction, Professor Sokolow. Thanks to the Princeton Environmental Institute for the invitation to speak. And I just wanted to say briefly, I'm happy to see some familiar faces in the audience. My old classmate, Greg Hammett, who's still here at the Princeton Plasma Lab, and Bob Motley, who was my advisor back when I was chasing plasma waves through a vacuum chamber, and the surprise visit by Representative Holt. Thanks very much for coming. Really appreciate it. And to everyone else, thanks for coming to the talk. The first half of the talk will deal mainly with the Gulf spill, as you see here, and the second with a form of geothermal energy that also requires deep drilling. And the plan is basically to touch on some of the central issues, go a little lightly on the technical detail, and then leave the rest for questions. So I hope that works for you. This is not a talk on why we should not drill deep for energy. It's a talk on why we should not drill deep without acknowledging that in doing so, we are entering a place that is in many ways as strange and perilous as the surface of a Jovian moon. In discussing those perils, we'll try to keep in mind that there are truly remarkable variations in the way human beings assess and perceive environmental risks, and then react and communicate their objections about those risks. In the case of the Gulf spill, those reactions were not very hard to anticipate. But when it comes to the small and medium-sized earthquakes generated by geothermal energy, the kind I'll discuss, the objections often seem to take the technical community by surprise. But in an absolute sense, drilling miles beneath the surface of the Earth simply brings us to extreme and very often unpredictable conditions. That drilling is undertaken to satisfy our insatiable demand for energy and driven by an enormous potential for profit. And although those operations can very likely be done safely, recent events have shown that they can just as easily lead to catastrophe. In covering some of those disastrous outcomes, I've learned another lesson in human behavior. that plucky engineers and entrepreneurs are very often unwilling to step back and assess the true extent of the risks their work entails, and even more disinclined to communicate those risks to the public before the worst happens. Here are 2 brief studies in what that toxic combination can produce. So I'll show you the slides. These are, the photos are all thanks to my colleagues at the Times, and it's provided by the New York Times. Here are just some of the shots. Some of them may be already burned into your recollection from the Gulf spill, the first topic. So let's start with the beginning of the Gulf spill disaster. Don't worry too much about the details of this graphic, but this is the final 18 minutes on April 20th before the explosion on the Deepwater horizon. And what you see here are various diagnostics showing pressures, liquids coming up out of the well and onto the deck of the Deepwater horizon, which was the platform, as you remember, out there that had been leased by BP to do this exploratory well. And what you see is things sort of going haywire during a time when the well workers should have been attuned to the fact that when you're seeing this kind of erratic behavior from below, some sort of action is needed. And that points to the fact, we'll discuss some of the technical reasons this wasn't contained in the end, but there are a lot of other investigations on whether the workers, management, and so forth acted properly in the last minutes. A lot of those questions are unresolved. But this sort of shows you just how crazy things were getting as the well started kicking up pressure and they began to get these sort of readings on the rig. I thought you might be interested. I apologize for the poor quality of some of the documentary stuff that we have obtained at various times, but these are early logs. And what you'll see up there in the blue arrow up here is the first call to the sister ship, the Enterprise, that there's a problem aboard the Deepwater horizon. And then the record continues over here in the early part of it. Over here is, in the early morning, we see the first indication that will be the news that 11 people were lost. Here's 11 confirmed lost. And this is just sort of how it plays out in sort of documentary reality as these disasters unfold. The explosion sent hydrocarbons up the blowout sent hydrocarbons up this what's called the riser, because they were in a mile of water, and then it was down another 13,000 feet into the bottom of the Gulf. When the oil and gas reached the rig, eventually sparks set off this explosion, and this is what you see when the Coast Guard came to respond. Just a note, from the very first moments, just along the theme we were discussing before, the reaction on the part of many of the officials at BP was to minimize the disaster rather than really get their minds, at least publicly, around what was actually happening. Now, behind the scenes, here are some other documents we obtained. Behind the scenes, engineers at BP, see here and elsewhere, this was a crisis team, were furiously trying to figure out what to do. Again, I thought you might be interested in this. This is the late night of the 21st and early 22nd. Remember, the explosion initially is on the 20th, and they're making notes as what's happening. Accumulator, we'll get back to some of these technical details, but it's the hydraulic boost for what will be the last possible finger in the dike, a device that I'll show you in a moment called a blowout preventer, which obviously failed. The accumulator pressure is what runs it. And then here's two more explosions, rig listing, high risk of sinking, as you see, scrawled there. And here's what happened on the afternoon of the 22nd. Indeed, as the engineers feared, the rig began to sink. You see it tilting there and finally sank to the bottom of the Gulf. So what's...
When were the 11 fatalities? Not here, but earlier.
Yeah, it was very early on, because in the initial explosion, some of the men were confined in a place called the mud room. Some were right at the top of the opening of the well on the rig, and they had no chance. And others died soon after. So it was very quick, the fatalities. That's right. Yeah, it was abandoned very soon. Now, you don't have to absorb all this information right now. I'm going to play an animation in a second that helps here. But there are a lot of things that obviously went on in this disaster, especially the ones, events that may have precipitated it. There are investigations ongoing suggesting that the cement job, which is what you have to do, you have to put an annulus of cement down the outside of these wells once you drill them to keep hydrocarbons from flowing in, that may not have been done very well. That once that was done, there's something called a cement bond log, which is a test to go and test the integrity of that cement. Should have been done, but was not. There's a fitting at the bottom that is a metal fitting, again, to insulate the open well from the pressure of the hydrocarbon well that you're drilling into. Suggestions that wasn't done properly. All of that is still being worked out. What we're going to focus on here is what was supposed to be their last line of defense if all else failed. And that's this blowout preventer. The blowout preventer right now that was at the bottom has been taken out. It's being autopsied by a Norwegian engineering firm, and the results of that aren't in yet. So we're dealing with our sources. Some of them have seen the blowout preventer. Some of them just know what took place. And, of course, we've got a lot of documentation as well. So this thing is 54 feet high. It sits on the bottom of the seafloor. Weighs 400 tons. Costs $25 million. And what it is, it's something that under normal circumstances just lets the drill string go down and do its job. And once the time comes, the hydrocarbons come up. But it also tries to slow the flow of material up when necessary, or in an emergency stop that from happening. And a lot of stuff going on here, and all these things here are called rams. They do various things. Some down here, it's called a variable bore ram. It sort of constricts around the outside of the drill pipe, leaving the middle of the drill pipe open. Up here, there's an annular thing that sort of does the same thing but squeezes this way, and so on. The really important one here is, if I've got this one right here, we've got the blind shear ram. And the reason that's the critical one is we're talking about the last finger in the dike, and this was the one that was supposed to save the Deepwater Horizon. And the way that was supposed to happen is I'll show you a more detailed picture in a moment, but what it does is it's supposed to first shear the pipe, shear completely through the drill pipe, and then rubber seals are supposed to seal the resulting opening, and you've saved the day. And if this had worked the way it was supposed to, that's what it would have done. It would have saved the day. Now, instead of giving a lot of separate explanation of this, it's a little easier if I just show you this animation that we did. So explains a little more easily what exactly goes on here. So it's designed to prevent the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. Investigators focused on the failure of a part of the well's blowout preventer that is supposed to seal off a well spewing out of control. The device, called a blind shear ram, cuts the drill pipe and seals off the well in a blowout. While the blowout preventer has many components, only the blind shear ram can completely seal the well. It is the last line of defense. After the explosion, at least one rig worker hit the emergency button to activate the blind shear ram. The system is designed to send an electrical signal from the rig to one of two control pods on the top of the device. The control pod sends hydraulic fluid from pressurized canisters to the blind shear ram. The fluid enters through a T-shaped valve called a shuttle valve, pushing the pistons which drive the ram to shear the drill pipe. A ram with rubber seals closes off the well. Locks move into place, preventing the pistons from moving backward. Oil pushing up from the well adds pressure, helping to keep the ram closed. But the blind shear ram did not fully deploy that night. And a number of the blowout preventer's components have come under scrutiny, in particular those that have no backup. One example of this is a shuttle valve. As the hydraulic fluid flows through the system, it
has two possible pathways until it reaches the valve. Here, the hydraulic fluid has only one place to enter the blind shear ram. So if the valve fails, the well will not be sealed. There is no backup. It gives you a bit of an overview. Now, that's a qualitative look at what a blowout preventer is, some of the critical components. And I want to say before we get into this part of it, this is not purport to be an explanation of what went wrong. We don't know yet what went wrong, and there's a number of possibilities. But we're going to focus on this issue of redundancy and what the companies themselves realized were the vulnerable points in this last line of defense before they put the thing underwater. And here's a study that I found in the documentation from April 2000. It was commissioned by Cameron, which made the blowout preventer. It was known at this time that it was going to go on the Deepwater Horizon and was done by an outside company. And what this is, it's something that's familiar in the nuclear industry. It's called a fault tree analysis. And what that does is that it focuses in on most likely points of failure or where most of the risk is in the device that you're about to build. And what they find is that this shuttle valve, and it's all about redundancy. You know, it's all about the fact that there's only one. Stabilized hydraulics represents single failure point, and they find ultimately that this single shuttle valve represents 56% of the risk, whatever that is, of the overall failure. Keep in mind, there's one shuttle valve. There's also just one blind shear ram. So the shuttle valve could fail, but also any other component of the blind shear ram, keep it right in here in a sense as well, because they chose to pick just one. Now, how much heated was this study? For some reason, they put this particular blowout preventer down with a single blind shear ram, but it's clear that Transocean, which owned the rig itself, leased to BP, knew that these kinds of results were coming in. They told me that at the time of the disaster, 11 of its 14 rigs in the Gulf had been outfitted with 2 blind shear rams, double blind shear rams, not the one that failed. And all 3 that didn't have them were older than the Deepwater Horizon, and all the other rigs under contract with BP in the Gulf at the time had 2 blind shear rams. So they clearly understood that redundancy was an issue. And when I asked them why they did not fit Deepwater Horizon with double blind shear rams, they pleaded space issues. They said it would be too big. That was disputed. That issue, that argument was disputed by outside experts. This again is just a blow up, just so you see this odd thing called a blind shear ram. There's the shuttle valve. All these are redundant hydraulic systems. They do everything on these things they can to make the system's redundant. They've got this yellow and blue system. Ultimately, though, it has to come through this one valve into the one blind shear ram. It's an odd device. You can see how this is the part that cuts the pipe, and then these seals then are supposed to hold and keep the seal across there. Now, we don't have the results in the various studies that are being done, but I just thought I'd show you. This was an early view of BP's idea of what was inside these things. You can't see inside these very well because they're big carcasses of steel, but the hope at as they began to try to save things at the bottom of the Gulf was that this critical blind shear ram had almost crimped through this pipe. And when you saw all of those, we call them the ROVs, the submersibles, the reason they were swarming around there mostly at the beginning was that they believed they could pump enough hydraulic fluid in the system to get this last inch and make that thing stop flowing. That was the felt belief. Now, they couldn't prove that this was the disposition inside there because they couldn't see. And they called upon a number of physicists here in the audience. They called upon our friends at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where they're very skilled at using gamma rays to measure explosions, whether conventional or nuclear. Because gamma rays can penetrate some of this thick steel. And they sent a guy named Scott Watson down to the Gulf in mid-May. This is, need to understand all this really, but basically this shows you one view of the blind shear rim. There's a thing behind it called a wedge lock, and there's a little skinny tube that sticks out of the side of this blowout preventer. It's the one place where gamma rays, it's thin enough that gamma rays can actually look through and see whether this thing had deployed or whether it was still stuck back the way that they believed that it was. They decided to do this measurement before they went once more for some more intervention with these ROVs, still hoping they could shut it down. And it's very hard to see, but what Scott's measurements showed, and this was an extremely unpopular finding at the time, I understand with BP, was that in fact it had been deployed all the time. You can barely see the line of this wedge lock there, but it's there. And as our piece put it, this indicated that in fact throughout this whole period the last line of defense was in effect a useless carcass of steel because there was nowhere for them to go, and that's when they began the top kill and all the other methods that they tried later, not using the blowout preventer to stop things. And it was another indication that there are mysteries as to how this thing works, how well it works, what conditions it can prevent from happening, and which it can't. And these were all things that while they were in a lot of the technical studies we found, even ones that were commissioned by the Interior Department, which is in charge of all this, they found these vulnerabilities. They were not discussed publicly to any extent. And that was the end of the story, really, for the blowout preventer, because there was nothing left but to try to just plug it in another way. Now, there are a number of interim reports. Nothing definitive has been out there, but there's been some testimony and so on. In September, BP put out its own report. Despite this gamma ray evidence, BP still believes and maintains that it was really a management issue, a maintenance issue, that the pods delivering the hydraulic fluid were not maintained properly, and the blind shear rim did not deploy, at least not in the initial moments. But as recently as last month, a senior Transocean official says that one of the ROVs got a peek with its video camera inside the blowout preventer by looking down from the top after the oil stopped flowing, and what he saw suggested the blind shear rim had in fact closed, but for whatever reason, either because it wasn't capable, maybe the hydraulics from the shuttle valve weren't working properly, or leaking, it didn't seal well. And that's the mystery that still remains until probably we get the results from that autopsy report, which the Norwegian firm is carrying out. But here are just a few last shots there. Some of our guys down in the Gulf while this was all happening. Sorry. So that's that. Now here's the second part of the talk. And we can come back to that with questions if you have any. I'm finished. Deep geothermal energy. This is a place north of San Francisco called the Geysers. And it's a place that for a long time has produced traditional, we call it traditional geothermal energy, which means that you tap into shallow, hot steam or water and capture them in these tubes and then produce what is billed as renewable energy. But this is very, as I said, shallow. We're talking hundreds of feet in many cases. You don't really have to drill very far. Now, the latest, greatest thing is something called enhanced geothermal energy. A lot of research on this lately. And what is that? Well, this uses the information that there isn't hot water in shallow places all over, but what you do have, if you drill down 2 or 3 miles, you've always got hot crust. And it's usually in some sort of bedrock. Now, it doesn't always have water, and it doesn't always have a way to circulate water through, so that the idea with this enhanced geothermal is to drill down, drill a hole, and then you put in high pressure water, and you do what's called fracturing, which is open up all kinds of fissures down inside this rock. Later you may drill a second one, and since it's hot down there, all you have to do is supply the water. So you pump the water down one, circulates over to the other, gets very hot, comes back up, and you've got enormous amounts of energy. And this is a form of renewable energy that has excited a great deal of interest on the part of the green community. There's hot crust everywhere, and so why not give it a try? There's technical issues involved. This gives you a hint as to where we're going here. This is in 1356. The largest recorded earthquake in northern Europe took place in Basel. And I went out there. I went not to this particular scene, but I went to Basel. And every school child there knows that 2 steeples of the Munster Cathedral fell into the Rhine, and the city was devastated. It so happens that the 650th anniversary of that disaster was in 2006. And in case of constantly bad timing, a researcher decided to try enhanced geothermal in the middle of Basel that year when they were having seminars, TV programs, reminiscences, tours of the city, the Munster Cathedral. And what he did was he set off a series of earthquakes, including a 3.4 quake on December 8, 2006, outraged the city. I'll give a little more detail on how this happened a bit. Eventually, $8 million in damages were awarded. Get to the next slide. Here's the head of the project. Here's Marcus Herring, he's a former oil guy. That's how he knew about drilling. He wanted to do something good for his hometown. He traveled around northern Europe, Norway, worked a lot during his oil career, and good-hearted fellow who wanted to bring renewable energy to Basel, which is one of the most environmentally conscious areas of the world. I've been over there, and was just met with huge enthusiasm. The problem with these quakes, Mr. Herring thought that these sorts of quakes would be shrugged off the way they are in California and so on. And here's where sort of a misunderstanding on the part of the technical community comes in, because first of all, these quakes weren't really like natural quakes. They're shallow, and they hit with a sudden smack, and people often thought that a truck had backed into their house or a bomb had gone off in their backyard. And they're also, unfortunately, accompanied that it makes the earth sort of act like a big subwoofer. And it sounds as if supersonic jets went overhead or a giant tearing noise, scared people to death. In fact, the people who were doing this, who were pumping the water in to do the fracturing, were in a control room a few miles away from the actual site. And they felt a boom. They had started turning down the water, I should say, because they thought something was going wrong. They started turning down the water. They felt the boom. They heard the jet go overhead, and one of them looked to the others and said, "I think that was us." And in fact, it was. It was them. A police car soon arrived to take Mr. Herring in to be questioned and explain what went on. Ultimately, he was actually indicted on criminal charges, as you see, and then he was acquitted in the wake of this, and that was a fairly bitter guy. They were right in the center, a little industrial area off the shopping part of the city. So and the thing about geothermal is that if it works, since it's everywhere, why not? If that's your motivation, and that's what he was thinking, because you have all these losses in travel time, right? If you're going to travel with the heat, you lose a lot of it. Why should I do that? Now, this episode, as much as burned into the minds of the Baselers over there, was not really reported in the United States, and essentially forgotten outside of Switzerland. And meanwhile, there was a big report that was put out by the Department of Energy by a lot of advocate scientists that this would be a great thing to do over here. It's fine. And they were totally right in their assessment that there's just tremendous amounts of untapped geothermal energy in the United States. A lot of it is in the west because the hot rocks tend to be a little shallower there. It happens to also be where earthquakes have broken up the crust. Now, the experts in this area call it the earthquakes that make induced seismicity and microseismicity and so on, which is a bit of a euphemism. But basically what the game is you want to create this little fractured reservoir below the surface, do the microseismicity, but not make an earthquake that's too big, so it's going to anger people. They've also gotten a lot of venture capital to to start to run these things, as well as DOE grants. Here's a little history. Altarock Energy has started up substantial backup money from Google and Kleiner Perkins, started drilling in that area called the geysers. As I said, the geysers already generated geothermal energy through this traditional means. This was a new attempt to drill much deeper to try to do this enhanced geothermal. In its environmental impact report, the company did not disclose that a similar project in Basel was shut down, the one I just told you about, because of the earthquakes it generated, and that became the subject of an article that I did in the Times. And it came out really the week they started drilling. Just a couple of pictures. Here's a project getting on. It looks a lot like an oil project up close, and a lot of the guys are from an oil drilling contractor getting started there at the geysers. That's not the ultimate tower there. That's something to test before they really started. They are doing a little more work. And just another shot of the geysers as it stands. It's a matter of daily business. This is the standard traditional sort of geothermal. It's kind of interesting. Just the pipes kind of threading through the hills, and the bends are basically so that firefighting equipment and other people can get through those places. So what's the geysers? This is an earthquake map, just showing that the interesting thing about the traditional geothermal, which got some coverage 20 years ago, and again it's sort of forgotten outside California, it also produces small earthquakes. Some people argue there could be an occasional large one, but it's indisputable that it makes small earthquakes, and the map shows that. The people there, especially in this town, Anderson Springs, are quite embittered by this whole thing because it messes with their lives. It eventually sort of ruins the paneling on their houses. It scares their cats. They have to warn their friends when they come to visit and so on. But it's just part of life up there for the most part, and it has been for quite a while. And this whole area, the geysers, produces around a gigawatt of electricity. That's about the amount that a nuclear power plant would take. But it takes a big area. You can see the area. So, a reporting side note: how do you come into a small town where nobody knows you as a reporter, create rapport, and get them to talk about what strange earthquakes are doing to their lives? You go and you do it the California way. Mrs. Felber, whose exercise routine was weighted hula hoop, and you see my reporter's notebook in my pocket right here. I was ready to go. I was going to my photographer did.
So a question.
Yeah.
This period, 2002, 2009, was when they were just tapping the shallow
That's right.
geothermal. Were they fracturing rock?
No, what happens, Greg, what happens there is that the water and the steam permeates this vast area under these hills, right? And they actually have to replenish the water. They bring up wastewater that's sort of cleaned up from Santa Clara and so on, because they take out steam and then they pump back down into it cool water which heats over this whole area. And so the whole area is like a sponge. It's always going like this, and that sponge movement is thought to be what you're seeing in these earthquakes. It's just it's a smaller rearrangement, not down at the level of the crust. So I went out there and gave the happy news to the folks in Anderson Springs about the Basel earthquake. And so here are the concerns that came up. Is that if you talk to, and this is another common thing in these sorts of fields, you talk to people who are very committed and very sophisticated, but very, very narrow in their dedication to the subject. They'll say there's no way we can set off a large earthquake, but then if you just go to University of Santa Barbara, California, Santa Barbara, and you ask the earthquake specialist there, do we understand induced seismicity? She'll say no. So the fears of these of Anderson Springs, first of all, they don't want more earthquakes. They are already picked up the earthquakes. But you have larger faults coming through. Here's a fault right here, so not so far away from where this is all happening. And of course, doesn't escape anybody's attention that the San Andreas fault is a little further away here. And what you'll get from the company is an absolute assurance that you can't set off any of those larger quakes. Although I was standing out with the project manager who doesn't even have a degree in geology, and I said, you know, people are worried. I was standing out on that side I showed you before. People are worried that you're going to set off a fault, which is only about 5 miles away. And he said, that's ridiculous. Don't worry about it. We do directional drilling. Everything we do is so we know exactly what we're doing. We're going to drill right out in this direction. And he pointed to the northeast, where there's no problem. I said, that's where the fault is. and he just, you know, that it's like it's two worlds that folks live in. But again, I don't want to make this sound as if we know either way. It's an unsolved problem. Induced seismicity is something that is like some particle physics problem that hasn't been solved. And so, you know, you can make reasonable arguments about it, but not with the certainty that the company officials were giving to the people in the town. And just to bring it to conclusion, here's the way it all sort of played out. The timesheets came out. The DOE, in due diligence, started a safety review of the project. The project was delayed not because of the review, but because it realized it was having big trouble drilling deep into this area of the geysers that had never been drilled in before. It was a kind of cap rock that was very snarly. And by September, they'd suspended the project and then finally abandoned it a day after Basel finally finished its own study, which permanently shut down Mr. Herring's project. Sorry about that. We'll get to the last slide here for a second. And there you go. Thank you very much. And take questions. Well, I guess I can talk. Go ahead. Yeah.
There's been some controversy about how much oil actually came out of the well in the Gulf, and some accusations that the administration lowballed these numbers. Has that been resolved at all?
No, I don't know if we will. I mean, by mid-May, the estimates were the 18 million barrels, which made the biggest spill in U.S. history, which I think it'll remain. But there were a lot of problems with that. One is that we didn't really have the right satellite imaging system that could give you day by day, minute by minute information about where the slick was. You know, I talked to the people who did this, and they said they were very frustrated because they would only be able to get an occasional picture that allowed them to see an overview of how much was there. You know, there's the obvious problem with underwater and difficult to quantify. But there's another thing is that I was telling you that BP thought that this blind shear ram had crimped in the beginning but not closed. And I think one of the reasons they thought that, remember their estimates very early on were extremely low, just how much was coming out. And it's not totally clear that those estimates were completely wrong because there is some evidence that it sort of started slow and then went faster, and that may have been because that blind shear ram sort of closed for a while and then opened back up again. And I think it's going to be pretty hard to bring the error bars down on that. And it's become politically charged. Yeah.
I'm just kind of concerned that there wasn't in general a plan B. I mean, with the documentation that the shearing might not have worked and then putting different mechanisms on different rigs, have they come out and said we had a plan B, that failed as well? It just seems they never came out and said our plan B didn't work either. Because they just went from the shear to whoops. You know what I mean? Was there ever a plan B that you came across?
Well, they did have.
Or cleanup plan, basically.
Yeah, they had these containment vessels. Of course, they had to build a special one for this. They thought they could do the top kill. The top kill involves, a lot of them involve these two sort of hoses that come out on the side of the blind shear of the blowout preventer, and they thought they could put stuff in there and sort of clog it up and all that. They had a plan B, but they just weren't very good at that. They had several plan Bs, and none of them was really very satisfactory.
I have a question
question about coverage of the congressional response. I was actually working in Senator Menendez's office from May to September on mainly response to the Deepwater Horizon, the oil liability cap, and then the Energy Committee bill on trying to do deeper regulatory reform. And following that, as I come back to Princeton, of course there has been a complete inability of the Senate to respond to the disaster and to also think about regulations for issues like the second one that you raised for geothermal. Are people still covering this? Are they raising this problem and discussing what we do now if we can as a federal government?
It's tough when things get politicized, which is very tough. And then the other point is that the second one, this is kind of an example. When things are technically complicated, you've got a problem all around. Because a lot of times I have to say on the environmental side, there's just not a very good understanding of technical issues. And sometimes Senate staffers, they'll have somebody who can understand it, but if they're only hearing from the heavy technical hitters from the oil side, they get overruled because they can make a better argument. And you get the same on the side of the oil. Sometimes they overstate what they really know, but other times they use the sort of technical high-handedness, is very common in this sort of thing, to say those idiots on the left, they can't even add 2 and 2. Why should we listen to them? And there's something to that, by the way, because you've got to have. There's a few places like the NRDC who make a point to have technical people in the House, but not everybody does.
There was an article recently in your competitive newspaper.
There's more than one. No, that one.
No, but about the fact that there were, I think it was like 28 incidents in the U.S. part of the Gulf of Mexico since 2009 of oil spill. And I just wanted you to comment on, the rise. Is it just attention we're getting that has been put on it, or is there carelessness, or is there another reason for the rise?
I don't think the Interior Department really did a very good job of keeping track of this. I mean, some of the best numbers we found was some Norwegian firm, that had been hired. David Barstow, who was heart and soul a lot of stuff, found a study in which 11 significant cases in which blowout preventers were activated were followed, and the disasters were varied in their size. They weren't all disasters. Some of them were just blowouts, but if you just look at did the blowout preventer work, it only worked 6 times out of 11. So, the statistical basis really isn't there, but the hints are, and really when you start to think about these things, sort of the gut feeling is that this is a little bit of a Rube Goldberg that probably isn't going to do what it's supposed to do.
You want to talk about what the macro concern is? You didn't put this in the context of oil drilling or thermal energy drilling. You really put this in the context of deep drilling. And what I'm wondering is the big concern really that we're messing with the hydraulics at a distance that we're really not comfortable, we don't really fully understand?
The answer is different in both cases, and I think in the case of the Gulf, it's not as if it's all that different from a gusher in Oklahoma in 1901 or something like that. But it's at the bottom of a mile of water, and that really affects things. And there may be differences because you are in an absolute sense deeper. You're down 18,000 feet. It's not a shallow oil well. But I think that you're not going to get. The answer is more. I think is what I was saying before. Technically, we're capable of doing this stuff. That's my theory. But because of all these sort of human failings that get in the way, we still call into play everything that we have. We fight about it, we try to minimize it, we use our pathetic PR skills to try to cover up what we don't know, instead of actually taking a skunk works approach and going in there and saying, here are the problems, I'm going to tell you up front, you're going to have a 3.4 earthquake occasionally, but you're going to have really cheap renewable energy. And putting that all together. So I think that's where the problem is. It's not so much on the technical side. I mean, I could be proved wrong. Anything else?
I thought you said 3.4 earthquake.
Well, it depends. They're all different. That's the thing. But on a shallow 3.4 earthquake, people's cats, jump up to the ceiling, and they think that something hit the back of their house, and sometimes the $8 million in damage is because it did crack a bunch of walls and things like that. A lot of it is people just, it's an invasion.
No features though.
No, it didn't. It doesn't really happen that way. It's just if you're in your house and it's quiet, these things are always worse, I found, if it's after about 6 o'clock at night. That people notice them because they're at home. The kids start crying. You know, they can't watch the TV program they wanted to watch. And it's an invasion of your home. And when you know that it's not an act of God, but it was some guy down the road who's trying to make a buck, that makes all the difference. It makes all the difference.
I've got two questions. One, you sort of touched on this one with respect to the Deepwater Horizon. And it strikes me based on, your analysis was based on failures of systems. And the implication of that is if we build a proper system, we know this. And so it truly is not an indictment, if you will, of deepwater oil drilling. Is that a fair assumption, or is there more here than you see out?
That's the way I would put it. I mean, other people are going to say, you know, when you go into this, it's like, that's why I mentioned moons and Jupiter to start off with. You know, there is an outer space element of this whole thing. You know, you saw that people can't go down there and fix this. Once the program, they send the little ROBs and all that stuff, and they're showing you up on the screen. You know, is that something that says fundamentally we can't do this? I don't think so. I really don't. But the problem, you know, now in this particular point where we are in society is that if you've got a bunch of one whole group of people who don't really understand the issues, another group that does but has a bunch of interests and not really revealing what they got, you know, and then something happens and then they're all blaming each other, you know, it's a mess. It's too complicated to deal with that. So that in that sense, it's a systems failure if you had the human element.
Yeah. My second question is, to what extent is there a relationship between what sounds like hydrofracking that's going on here in this and the hydrofracking that they're using to release gas?
Another controversial. You know, I think it's been put on hold in New York because they were trying to do fracking up in the watershed north of New York City. I think they pretty much stopped that. And Halliburton, the last I saw, Halliburton was refusing to explain exactly what fluids it's using to do the hydrofracking, because that's a big issue there. It's not a question of earthquakes, though. In that
Yeah, you don't hear about the earthquakes. That was really
no, you don't. It's pollution. It's like groundwater pollution. Yeah, so it's a different issue. It's the same process, though.
Why not? Why is it happening?
Yeah, why don't we hear about it?
Because it's shallow. You know, I think you have to get down into. I'm just guessing. I think that's why. That you're not going so deep for that sort of stuff. And it's also the other critical thing is that you're usually going into shale formations and things like that. We're talking about real bedrock in this case, right? Because and then you really have to move the earth over these things. With the shale, you do hear of some earthquakes happening in oil formations in Texas, and I thought about covering that, but they're pretty small and different.
Okay, what's next? Last one.
Getting back to the Gulf, do we know what is happening to the oil that did not surface? It's supposedly lying on that.
Again, it's a tough issue. You know, there have been conflicting scientific studies about whether it all sort of got vaporized. My colleague Bill Broad did a bunch of stories, one big one on these benthic organisms that live outside of any light and just live on oil because there are always oil seeps, you know, at the bottom of the Gulf. And Bill thinks they ate it all. Some people have seen dead organisms, and others have said that it was something natural. So I'm not an expert in that area, but all I can say is the tremendous amount of controversy in how it's played out.
Thank our speaker.